There's something wild about thinking that just a couple generations ago, nobody had ever stepped foot on another world. Like, your grandparents might remember exactly where they were when it happened. July 20, 1969. A guy from Ohio became the first human being to walk on the moon, and the whole thing was so insane that some people still don't believe it actually went down. But it did. And the man who took that first step was Neil Armstrong. This quiet, almost shy dude who never really wanted the fame that came with doing literally one of the most incredible things any human has ever done. His story isn't just about that one moment though, even though that's what everyone remembers. It's about how a kid who was obsessed with planes turned into a test pilot, then an astronaut, and then the guy who got picked to be first. And honestly, the whole journey is just as crazy as the destination. Neil was born in 1930 in a tiny town called Wapakonta, Ohio. His dad worked as an auditor for the state government, which meant the family moved around a bunch when Neil was little. They bounced between different small towns in Ohio, never really settling anywhere for too long. But even as a kid, Neil had this thing for flying. Like, he was genuinely obsessed. When he was 5 or 6 years old, his dad took him to the Cleveland air races, and apparently that just flipped a switch in his brain. He started building model airplanes, reading everything he could about aviation, just completely geeking out over anything that had wings and could get off the ground. By the time he was 14, he was taking flying lessons at the local airport. 14. Most kids that age are just trying to figure out how to talk to their crush without sounding like an idiot, and this guy was learning to pilot an actual airplane. He got his student pilot's license before he even got his driver's license, which is absolutely bonkers when you think about it. High school Neil was your classic quiet, smart kid. He wasn't the most outgoing guy in his class, didn't really run with the popular crowd or anything like that. He was in the marching band, played the baritone horn, was a Boy Scout. Pretty normal stuff. But he was also crazy disciplined and focused, especially when it came to anything related to flying or science. His grades were solid, and he had this reputation for being the guy who just figured things out. You know that kid in class who doesn't show off but somehow always knows the answer? That was Neil. After he graduated in 1947, he had this plan all mapped out. He wanted to study aeronautical engineering, and he managed to get a scholarship from the Navy that would pay for his college education. The deal was that he'd go to Purdue University, study engineering, and then serve in the Navy afterward. Pretty sweet arrangement, honestly. So he headed off to Purdue and dove into his engineering courses, but before he could even finish his degree, the Navy called him up. The Korean War had started, and they needed pilots. Neil was only 20 years old when he became a naval aviator. They sent him to flight training in Florida and then to Corpus Christi in Texas, and by August 1950, he had his wings. A few months later, he was deployed to Korea, flying combat missions off an aircraft carrier. And this wasn't just cruising around in the sky, this was serious, dangerous stuff. He flew 78 combat missions during the war, piloting these fighter jets called F-9F Panthers. On one mission, his plane got hit by anti-aircraft fire, and he had to eject over enemy territory. He managed to get back to friendly lines, but it was the kind of close call that would make most people reconsider their career choices. Not Neil, though. He finished his deployment, came back to the States, and went right back to Purdue to finish his engineering degree. After college, he could have done anything. Plenty of engineering jobs out there for a smart guy with a degree and military flight experience. But Neil wanted to push boundaries, wanted to fly the fastest and most experimental aircraft anyone was building. So in 1955, he joined the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which everyone just called NACA. It was basically NASA before NASA existed. They had this research center out in California called the High Speed Flight Station, which later became the Armstrong Flight Research Center, named after Neil himself. This place was where they tested all the crazy experimental planes that were pushing the limits of speed and altitude. And Neil became a test pilot there, flying aircraft that most people had never even heard of. He flew over 200 different types of aircraft during his career. Bombers, fighters, rockets, helicopters, gliders, you name it. If it could fly, he probably took it up at some point. The most famous plane he flew during this time was the X-15, which was less of a plane and more of a rocket with wings. This thing could fly at ridiculous speeds and altitudes, basically reaching the edge of space. Neil flew it 7 times, and on one flight he reached an altitude of over 200,000 feet, which is like almost 40 miles up. That's high enough that the sky turns black and you can see the curvature of the Earth. It was the closest thing to being an astronaut you could do without actually going to space. And that's exactly what caught NASA's attention. By this point, NASA had turned into NASA. The space race with the Soviet Union was heating up, and they needed smart, experienced pilots who could handle themselves in extreme situations. Neil fit the bill perfectly. In 1962, NASA selected him for their second group of astronauts. The press called them the New Nine, and they were joining the original Mercury 7 astronauts who had become national heroes. But Neil wasn't really interested in being a hero or a celebrity. He just wanted to fly, wanted to explore, wanted to be part of this incredible thing that humanity was doing. His first spaceflight came in 1966 with Gemini 8. He was the command pilot, and Dave Scott was with him. Their mission was to perform the first docking between 2 spacecraft in orbit, which sounds simple now, but was absolutely crucial for getting to the moon later. They needed to prove that 2 vehicles could meet up and connect in space, because the moon landing plan required the lunar module to dock with the command module in orbit around the moon. No docking capability meant no moon landing. So yeah, kind of important. The mission started off perfectly. They launched, rendezvoused with an unmanned target vehicle called the Aegina, and successfully docked with it. First time anyone had ever done that in space. Mission Control was celebrating, the astronauts were pumped, everything was going great. And then, about 30 minutes after docking, things went completely sideways. The spacecraft started spinning. Slowly at first, but then faster and faster. Neil and Dave thought it was the Aegina malfunctioning, so they undocked from it, thinking that would solve the problem. It didn't. The spinning got worse, way worse. They were rotating almost once per second, which in space is terrifyingly fast. The forces were getting so strong that they were starting to black out. If they couldn't get it under control in the next few seconds, they were going to lose consciousness and probably die up there. Neil had seconds to figure out what was happening. Most people would have panicked, but he stayed ice cold. He realized that the problem wasn't the Aegina, it was their own spacecraft. One of the thrusters on their Gemini capsule had stuck open and was just firing continuously, causing the spin. The regular control system couldn't override it. So he did something that probably saved their lives, but also meant they had to end the mission early. He shut down the main control system and activated the re-entry control system, which was only supposed to be used when coming back to Earth. But it had separate thrusters that he could use to stop the spin. And it worked. He got the spacecraft stabilized, got them back under control. But because he'd activated the re-entry system, mission rules said they had to come home immediately. They'd only been in space for about 11 hours. The mission was supposed to last 3 days and include a spacewalk and other experiments, but none of that mattered anymore. They had to get back to Earth. When they landed in the Pacific Ocean, some people at NASA were disappointed that the mission had been cut short. But the people who mattered, the people who understood what had actually happened up there, knew that Neil had just pulled off an incredible feat of piloting under pressure. If he'd made the wrong call, if he'd hesitated for even a few more seconds, he and Dave would have died. That mission pretty much cemented Neil's reputation as someone who could handle anything, someone who stayed calm when everything was falling apart. And that's probably a big part of why he got picked to command Apollo 11, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. After Gemini 8, Neil stayed in the astronaut program, training for Apollo missions. The whole Apollo program was this massive national effort to fulfill President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. Kennedy had made that promise back in 1961, and even though he didn't live to see it happen, NASA was determined to make it real. They had a whole series of Apollo missions planned to test different parts of the lunar landing system. Apollo 1 ended in tragedy when a fire killed 3 astronauts during a ground test. Apollo 7 tested the command module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 went all the way to the moon and orbited it, but didn't land. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 was basically a full dress rehearsal. taking the lunar module to the moon and getting within just a few miles of the surface, but not actually landing. And then it was time for Apollo 11. NASA had to pick a crew, and the commander's position was obviously the most important. There were several guys who could have done it, but NASA's leadership picked Neil. There's been a lot of speculation over the years about why exactly he was chosen. Some people say it was because of his performance on Gemini 8, his coolness under pressure. Some say it was because of his engineering background and his test pilot experience. Some people have suggested it was partly because of his personality, because he was humble and quiet and wouldn't let the fame go to his head. Honestly, it was probably all of those things. NASA wanted someone competent, sure, but they also wanted someone who would represent the achievement in the right way, who would make it about humanity's accomplishment rather than personal glory. Neil's crewmates were Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. Buzz would go to the lunar surface with Neil, and Mike would stay in orbit in the command module, keeping the home fires burning while the other two were down on the moon. All three of them were experienced, all three were brilliant, and all three spent months training for every possible scenario. They practiced in simulators for hours and hours, running through the lunar landing procedure over and over. They studied geology so they'd know what to look for on the moon. They did public appearances and press conferences. The whole world was watching, waiting to see if they could actually pull this off. The Soviets had beaten America to pretty much every milestone in space up to that point. First satellite, first animal in space, first human in space, first spacewalk, first probe to hit the moon. But they hadn't managed a manned lunar landing, and the U.S. was determined to get there first. July 16, 1969. Launch day. The Saturn V rocket was the biggest, most powerful rocket ever built, and it was sitting on the pad at Kennedy Space Center with 3 guys strapped to the top of it. About 1 million people showed up to watch in person, and millions more watched on TV. The countdown hit 0, the engines ignited, and this absolutely massive machine started lifting off the ground. Neil said later that the ride was smoother than he expected for something so huge, but it was still incredibly violent and quiet. The spacecraft was small, cramped, just enough room for 3 guys and their equipment. They did some TV broadcasts showing people back home what it was like in space, did systems checks, ate their weird space food, tried to sleep in shifts. On July 19, they swung around behind the moon and fired their engines to slow down and enter lunar orbit. And that's when things started getting real. The next day, Neil and Buzz put on their spacesuits and crawled through a tunnel into the lunar module, which they'd named Eagle. Mike stayed behind in the command module, Columbia. The 2 spacecraft separated, and Neil and Buzz started their descent toward the surface. This part, the landing, was where everything could go wrong. And honestly, it almost did. Neil was piloting the lunar module manually, with Buzz calling out information from the instruments. They were descending toward a landing site in an area called the Sea of Tranquility, which is this big flat plain on the moon's surface. But as they got closer, Neil looked out the window and saw that the computer was taking them toward a boulder field next to a big crater. If they tried to land there, they'd probably tip over or crash into the rocks. So he took over manual control and started flying the lunar module like a helicopter, searching for a smoother spot. Meanwhile, the fuel gauge was dropping. They only had a limited amount of fuel for the landing, and it was running out fast. Mission Control was getting nervous. The flight controllers were calling out the fuel remaining. 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 20 seconds. Neil stayed completely calm. He found a clear spot, brought the lunar module down, and at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, the Eagle touched down on the moon. The first words from the surface were Neil's voice saying, "The Eagle has landed." Mission Control erupted in cheers and applause. They'd done it. 2 human beings were sitting in a spacecraft on the surface of another world, but they weren't going outside right away. First, they had to run through all the post-landing checklists, make sure all the systems were good, prepare for a quick launch if something went wrong. They were supposed to take a sleep period before the moonwalk, but neither of them could sleep. They were too wired, too excited. So they asked Mission Control if they could skip the sleep and go ahead with the moonwalk. Mission Control said yes. It took them hours to get ready. They had to put on their spacesuits, check all the connections, depressurize the cabin, open the hatch. Finally, around 10:30 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Neil started backing out of the hatch and climbing down the ladder on the outside of the lunar module. There was a TV camera mounted on the outside of the spacecraft, showing everything to the world. People everywhere were glued to their TVs, watching this grainy black and white image of an astronaut slowly descending a ladder. When Neil reached the bottom rung, he stepped onto one of the landing pads. Then he said he was going to step off the pad onto the surface. And then he did. His left foot touched the lunar dust, and he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Except that's not exactly what he meant to say. He'd planned to say one small step for a man, with the article a in there, which would have made the sentence make more grammatical sense. But the either got lost in the transmission, or he just flubbed the line in the moment. Either way, nobody really cared. The meaning was clear. After billions of years of life existing only on Earth, humans had finally made it to another celestial body. It was July 20, 1969, and everything had changed. Buzz joined him on the surface a few minutes later, and the two of them spent about 2.5 hours outside. They planted an American flag, collected rock and soil samples, set up some scientific experiments, took photographs, talked to President Nixon on the phone. The whole time, they were bouncing around in the low gravity, which is about 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Everything they did looked kind of slow motion and dreamlike. They described what they saw, and it sounded almost alien. The lunar surface was this fine, powdery dust that stuck to everything. The sky was completely black, no atmosphere to scatter light. The sun was blazingly bright, but shadows were pitch dark. Earth was hanging in that black sky, looking like this tiny, fragile blue marble. When their moonwalk time was up, they climbed back into the lunar module, sealed the hatch, and tried to get some rest. The next day, they fired the ascent engine to launch off the moon's surface and rendezvous with Mike in the command module. This was another critical moment. If that engine didn't fire, they'd be stuck on the moon forever. But it worked perfectly. They met up with Mike, transferred back to the command module with their moon rocks, and then jettisoned the lunar module. It eventually crashed back into the moon's surface. The trip home took another 3 days. When they got close to Earth, they separated the command module from the service module and plunged into the atmosphere at something like 25,000 miles per hour. The heat shield protected them from the intense heat of re-entry, parachutes deployed, and they splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24. The Navy picked them up and immediately put them into quarantine for a couple of weeks, just in case they'd brought back any weird moon germs. They hadn't, obviously, but NASA wasn't taking any chances. Once they were out of quarantine, they were instant global celebrities. There were parades, medals, speaking tour, everything you can imagine. They met world leaders, were treated like heroes everywhere they went. It was overwhelming, especially for a guy like Neil who'd never wanted that kind of attention. And here's the thing about Neil Armstrong that made him different from a lot of heroes. He genuinely didn't think he deserved all the fuss. He always said that he was just doing his job, that thousands of people at NASA and the contractors had made the moon landing possible, and he just happened to be the guy who got to take the first step. He turned down most interviews, didn't write an autobiography for decades, avoided the spotlight as much as he could. He taught aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati for a while, served on a couple of corporate boards, did some consulting work. He lived a pretty quiet life on a farm in Ohio, the same state where he grew up. When people recognized him, which they did constantly, he was always polite but never made a big deal about it. There's this story about him being asked for an autograph by someone who wanted to sell it. Neil refused, said he didn't like the idea of people making money off his signature. He knew there was a whole market of people buying and selling Apollo memorabilia, and it bothered him. He thought the moon landing should be about the achievement, not about commerce or personal profit. That's just who he was. He gave occasional speeches, usually focusing on the future of space exploration rather than his own past. He served on the investigation board after the Challenger disaster in 1986, helping figure out what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. He believed deeply in the importance of space exploration, thought humanity should keep pushing outward, keep exploring. Neil passed away in 2012 at the age of 82, following complications from heart surgery. The tributes poured in from around the world. President Obama called him one of the greatest American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time. NASA administrators, fellow astronauts, world leaders, everyone had something to say about what he'd meant, what he'd accomplished. But even in death, his family asked that instead of mourning, people should honor his memory by looking up at the moon on a clear night and giving it a wink, a private tribute from anyone who wanted to remember him. That was so perfectly Neil Armstrong. No grand monuments or public displays, just a quiet personal moment. Looking back now, more than 50 years later, it's wild to think about what he did. Humans haven't been back to the moon since 1972. That's half a century of nobody walking on the lunar surface, even though we have way better technology now than we did then. It makes that achievement seem even more remarkable. In the late 1960s, with computers that had less processing power than a modern calculator, with materials and techniques that seem primitive now, we sent people to another world and brought them home safely. And Neil Armstrong was the